People tend to have stronger opinions about issues, and they see the other side as the enemy. And when you hear people talk about political polarization, which is another form, by the way, the noun form polarization, or things being very polarized, or the issue being polarizing, a polarizing issue, we're talking about strong opinions and things that cause people to fight from opposite sides, maybe villainize each other, fighting from opposite sides on that particular issue, right? What we're going to do is learn some useful language from a video called How to Prepare for the Next Global Recession. This video is from The Economist. We're going to be going through it and just pulling out the language and also noting, just out of curiosity, what is their perspective on the possibility of a global recession before the real recession, right? They were not aware, I believe, even of COVID when they made this video. This was pre-COVID and obviously, because it's pre-COVID, pre-global recession. So I'm very curious for their take, okay? All right, so let's get into it. And of course, we're going to be doing our old word bank. And our word bank is where we're going to be writing stuff down, okay? We're not going to learn everything. When you watch a video, you want to pick out some stuff that's useful, some stuff that's interesting. You don't want to say, I will write down every single thing I don't know, because then then you are not focusing on, enjoying the video, right? So you want to do that too. All right, here we go.
We focused on this now because it's been a decade since the global recession of 2008 and 2009, and some interesting and worrying vulnerabilities are also popping up at the moment. In 2008 and 2009, the dominoes were really set up for quite a nasty financial and economic crisis. This time, the economic moment.
The dominoes were set up.
2008 and 2009, the dominoes were really set up for.
The dominoes were really set up for quite a nasty financial and economic crisis this time. So this is an interesting expression. We use dominoes when we talk about potential consequences, potential outcomes, potential events, whether we're talking about them retroactively to try to explain why this happened, or whether we're talking about something that could happen in the future, right? So we say something like, the dominoes were set. The dominoes were set up for. Now, sometimes we just say the domino effect. The domino effect is one thing leads to another thing leads to another. And that is a little different because then we're talking about the links between the events, right? And the dominoes are set up as sort of like there's a vulnerability. In fact, he uses the word vulnerable earlier to say there's a weakness there. And that weakness, because there's that weakness, there is a chance for things to go wrong. If there's a vulnerability, that doesn't mean that the issue is there. It means that the potential issue is there. If certain things happen, then because of the vulnerability, bad things will happen, okay? Vulnerability. The adjective form, by the way, is vulnerable. Vulnerability is the noun form. Okay. Back to it.
Quite a nasty.
Look at that video quality. You can tell that that's 2008, 2009. It's amazing. I'm always amazed by, at the time, whenever I'm watching something, I think, this looks natural. This video quality looks like real life. And then when I see video played back from 10 years ago, it looks really old. And I think, well, that's what the world looked like back then? And so then I think, well, now when I look at things on TV, I think that's how it really looks. That's how life looks. When I look at myself and I look at the TV, I think, yeah, that's about the same. That's about right. But then in 10 years from now, I'll look back at that and I'll say, whoa, that looks so old. What the heck? Like, this looks like the 70s or something. It looks ancient.
The financial and economic crisis. This time, the economic vulnerabilities aren't quite as large. They're large enough that we could see a slowdown in GDP.
Why is everybody, what are they doing on the phone? It looks like some finance bros talking on the phone, making some deals.
Growth, the slowdown in trade, and things of that nature. The real risk is that our lack of preparedness and the lack of room for global cooperation will turn what starts as kind of a minor downturn into something much larger and much more difficult to deal with sometime in the next year or two.
Well, that's a pretty good prediction, I would say. He uses the term downturn. He's used it a couple times now, so I think it's worth noting it. So a downturn, specifically in terms of the economy, is usually almost always used to talk about the economy. It's not usually used to talk about, for example, specific companies' revenue. You wouldn't say, for example, there was a downturn in my income this year. You would say there's a downturn in the economy. So it's usually a fairly broad term to talk about trends, right? You could talk about downturns possibly in climate. You could talk about downturns in a lot of different things, but usually we're talking about fairly broad trends rather than talking about a specific case, your individual situation. You probably would not use the word downturn. Here we're talking about trends, big trends. And I would say most often it's used for economic stuff.
The last big global downturn began in the United States with the collapse of the housing bubble and the financial sector there. Next time,
if you didn't hear that, collapse of the housing bubble. So we use bubbles when we're talking about things that get, basically the value of the thing is not actually what it looks like it is. So maybe housing bubbles means the price of homes is very high, but the true value is lower, and something has artificially driven the price of houses higher, but it's a bubble because when it pops, things will crash down suddenly. There was a bubble in crypto. Things get inflated, and that means that the true value is not where it actually is. Or right now, it's at a place where it's not representing the true value of where it should be, and that's what we call a bubble, because there's potential for it to be popped.
The trouble is much more likely to start elsewhere, and perhaps in the emerging world. Emerging economies are a much larger share of global.
How about a global pandemic called COVID?
Output than they used to be. They've also gone on something of a borrowing binge over the last 10 years.
Something of a borrowing binge. I think that's worth learning. Emerging markets have gone on something of a borrowing binge. Very useful word, binge. To binge means to consume a lot at one time, usually in an uncontrolled fashion, right? So we use binge when we talk about a TV show that we can't stop watching. They release a new series and we just stay up all night and watch the whole thing. Well, what are you doing? You are binge watching. You are binging on that show. It's unhealthy. It's too much. It's not balanced, right? And the same thing would be, for example, if you binge on food. If you binge eat, usually that's not good for you because you're consuming way too much food in a short span of time, and that's bad for you in a lot of different ways. Obviously, weight gain and all kinds of other problems. So binge is never used in a positive sense as far as I can judge. At least off the top of my head, binge is not something people use in a positive sense. I guess for binging a TV show, it's not that bad, right? If we really enjoy it, so we binge watch it. That's probably the most, let's say, harmless way that it's used. But a borrowing binge means that they're borrowing perhaps too much, they're borrowing a lot, and because of that, there's now some vulnerability, right? It's a borrowing binge. They've probably gone overboard with their borrowing, and that's probably going to be a problem. Okay, so let's let's keep going. Oh, and something of a borrowing binge. That's just a way to phrase it, right? I'm something of an expert. They've gone on something of a borrowing binge, right? There's not a lot of meaning in that phrasing. Something of a is sort of like, it's approximate to that. It's just a way to introduce that concept. Something of a something. I'm something of a something. I'm something of a something. Ah, okay.
Which means that they could be due for a reckoning. There are also reasons to be concerned about.
That's why I'm not writing down everything. It's very tempting to say due for a reckoning. Oh, that's a good one. A reckoning, that's a really good word. I'm not going to write it down because I don't want to get bogged down in defining everything, right? But look that one up yourself. Due for a reckoning. A reckoning, that's a great word. I like it.
About the euro area, and in particular Italy, which has an enormous public debt problem and where markets have been feeling a bit jittery about.
Those guys don't look human, okay? I don't know who those guys are, but look at how they walk. They're very stiff. I think maybe there are reptiles living inside of their bodies, controlling them with joysticks, and that's why they walk like that. I don't know who those people are, but I think they're being controlled by reptiles with joysticks.
Debt problem, and where markets have been feeling a.
Look how he walks. Something off about that. Reptiles, joysticks.
A bit jittery about their ability to pay that back, and that could relaunch the euro area debt crisis that we saw about a half decade ago.
Euro area, just to be clear, when he's saying euro area, European Union, where the euro is used, area. Okay, just in case you didn't catch that. A decade and a half ago, 15 years ago.
The tools governments normally use to fight a recession won't be available in the same way that they normally are the next time around. Interest rates will be very low, and so we normally rely on central banks to do interest rate cutting to perk up.
Okay, so they are raising an interesting point here that's relevant. Interest rates being low, they did seem to predict that that would be an issue, and that was a major issue in the financial or economic issues that we're experiencing now. Interest rates are at the top of everyone's mind. They had to, in order to fix the inflation problems, they had to raise interest rates in a big way, and they're still doing so at the time of me saying this. Yeah, sorry guys, I don't watch a lot of news. If I don't know politicians, I just don't care. I don't care.
Spending, perk up growth, and they're not going to be able to do that. So pretty quickly, they're going to have to turn to less tested methods. Money printing to buy bonds, quantitative easing was something that was used last time. That's going to be used again, but that works in a much more uncertain way and is much more politically contentious than some of the tools that are ordinarily used. Within country.
Nice music. Dun, 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 dun. I've noticed that marimba is the go-to instrument for all informational videos. Did you notice that? Marimba is that dun, 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 that sound. If you watch a lot of videos, and I think it's getting less common because there was marimba saturation in the market of content for any content related pieces. And I have a couple videos in the past where I use marimba as well, where you're trying to explain something, a principle, a concept, introduce an idea, then you use marimba. And then there was marimba overkill, marimba saturation, and now we're seeing a crash in the marimba consumption market. There's no audience for marimba these days. So this video is very passé, it seems.
The problem is that government is much more polarized. Across the world, you have many more populist parties, nationalist parties.
Polarized is one I do want to focus on, right? So if you have polarization, the adjective form of that is polarized, and we can use the ing form as well. So let's say you have a polarizing issue. A polarizing issue is one where people tend to have very strong opinions on one side or the other. It's not an issue that people just don't really worry about, right? Not a lot of people care about or think about. And it seems like the world has become more polarized, with a D there, meaning that people have stronger issues on two political sides, let's say left and right, maybe conservative, liberal, right? There are different sort of, you could use different ends of the poles. You could describe those in different ways, but people tend to have stronger opinions about issues, and they see the other side as the enemy. And when you hear people talk about political polarization, which is another form, by the way, the noun form polarization, or things being very polarized, or the issue being polarizing, a polarizing issue, we're talking about strong opinions and things that cause people to fight from opposite sides, maybe villainize each other, fighting from opposite sides on that particular issue, right? Well, what's an issue that's not polarizing? That might be a tough one. How about an issue that's not polarizing? Is fruit juice a polarizing issue? I don't think so. I think that might be the last thing we have that's not polarizing. Everyone, I think, can get into fruit juice on one level or another. If you don't like orange juice, maybe you like apple juice. Maybe you don't like juice, but you're still okay with people drinking it, right? I feel like fruit juice is our final non-polarizing issue. Everything else is highly polarized. Even heating is becoming a polarizing issue. The way we heat our homes right now, there's a big debate going on about stoves and the environment, and it's very polarized. Fruit juice, I don't think so. I don't have any strong opinions about fruit juice, except that I really like pomegranate juice. Recently, I've been getting into 100% pomegranate juice. It's pretty sour, but I really like it. It's very satisfying, and it really quenches your thirst. Actually, maybe I have a very strong opinion about that, because if someone doesn't like pomegranate juice as much as me, they're my enemy. That's how I feel about it. Okay, anyway, back to the video.
And it's going to be very hard to reach the agreement that's necessary to launch big spending programs and things of that nature. Then you also have disagreements across countries.
I'm not going to write that down, but things of that nature is a way to say things like that. It's exactly the same. Things like that, things of that nature. What's the difference? The difference is in connotation, and the connotation would be things of that nature sounds more formal than things like that, okay? Things of that nature, yes.
Which means that it's much more likely you have contentious policies, tariffs that go up, currency wars, things of that nature as countries struggle to deal with the next downturn.
We've got a lot of the same words coming up. Downturn, polarize. We got a lot of the same terms returning, which is good.
Ideally, governments would be taking some steps right now to get ready for the next recession. They should be changing their central bank policy targets. What we've learned is that a low inflation target doesn't give central banks enough room to fight recessions before interest rates fall to zero. They should also be getting their budgets ready, which means preparing to include measures that will increase spending automatically when the economy weakens in the future, so that they don't have to have fights in Parliament about whether or not to expand spending when the time comes. But then, most important of all, I think, governments need to coordinate their responses with each other. That makes it much more likely that we don't enter a scenario like we did in the 1930s, when tariff barriers went up, when there were currency wars and
Enter a scenario. Listen.
Changing their central bank policy targets. What we've learned is that a low inflation target doesn't give central banks enough room to fight recessions before interest rates fall to zero. They should also be getting their budgets ready, which means preparing to include measures that will increase spending automatically when the economy weakens.
Is that the budget? Is that the budget? Is it in the budget? Is in that red box? Is that how they do it? That lizard man there holding the budget in a red box? Is that Downing Street in London? And this man is a reptile man being controlled by lizards with the budget in a red box. Is that what I'm seeing here?
In the future, so that they don't have to have fights in Parliament about whether or not to expand spending when the time comes. But then, most important of all, I think, governments need to coordinate their responses with each other. That makes it much more likely that we don't enter a scenario like we did in the 1930s.
Okay, enter a scenario. Now, scenario, you're probably familiar with this word, I would guess. Enter a scenario. So a scenario is similar to a situation, and a specific situation that is usually something you can imagine beforehand, right? I don't want to enter a scenario where, and then you would add where to it at the end, and then describe that future possible thing so that we can then make plans to avoid it, right? You often hear people say worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is that, and then you would describe the bad thing that could happen. That's the worst case scenario. It's a way to talk hypothetically about the future. The word scenario itself isn't negative or positive. You're just sort of painting a picture of a potential, right? And usually a scenario doesn't exist now. So if we're in it right now, so we wouldn't be talking about it as a scenario because it's what's happening right now. We would say, how do we fix this? What should we do now, right? But if we say, what about the best possible scenario? Where again, we're imagining probably in the future, because if we're imagining, it's not the past, probably. So we're probably imagining something, a way of doing things that will result in a specific set of circumstances, a specific situation that either we want or we want to avoid. That's usually how it is used. That's typically how we use a scenario. Here he's just saying a scenario, where or when, and then he's going to describe it. Worst case scenario is focusing on the negative, and you could also have what is the best case scenario. Same thing.
Currency wars and competitive devaluations, and when ultimately that led to some pretty significant and nasty geopolitical tension.
Significant and nasty geopolitical tension. Oh, I like that last phrase that he used. Let's spend a little time on that. Geopolitical tension. Geopolitical tension. Tension. And he also used contentious earlier. He used contentious. So tension just means there's two sides usually, and there's it's not smooth, it's not relaxed between them. There's some discomfort, there's some unease, there could be problems, right? Geopolitical is related to world politics. Geo means world, political politics. So geopolitical, adjective, tension is tension around the world politically. That's all it means. And if things are contentious, then there's some disagreements. So polarizing, contentious, and tension, all of these words are used to describe something very similar of this. These sides, and they're kind of not seeing things eye to eye, and they might have different interests, and those interests might cause them to have some conflict, right? Okay. So in this video, we didn't talk about every single thing, but we talked about dominoes being set up for something, or a domino effect. We talked about vulnerability or some weakness or something that could result in an issue. We talked about a downturn, usually for larger trends, when things go down or usually get worse. We talked about borrowing, binge borrowing, right? And binging on something, consuming a lot of it at an unhealthy level. So countries, developing countries, on a borrowing binge, right? You could use it as an adjective or a noun. Things being polarized or polarizing things, where we have these two sides and they are kind of in conflict. They have some tension, that feeling of between them, and then that would be contentious. So contentious is just another way to describe it, meaning that their interests are not aligned. They don't agree on everything, right? We talked about a scenario, a future scene, possible thing that could happen, best case, worst case scenario. So this is what you do if you want to learn from videos. You just pick out some stuff, you look it up, you make sure you pay attention to it in context, you practice it a bit. Check out my upcoming video about how to actually look stuff up in ChatGPT, how to use ChatGPT as sort of a companion tool for looking stuff up and practicing what you look up by making examples. So if you want, try to make examples with these words and phrases that we learned from this video. You can put those in the comments if you like. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and also check out my full courses in the links in the description.